4th episode, I believe, of our Moms Returning to Tech Reactor Sydney cohort. Lovely to have you all here today. And yeah, we've got a very special guest who's going to be doing a presentation. I'll get to introducing her in a minute. But firstly, my slide will change. Here we go. I'm Renee Noble. I'm the cloud advocate, not the regional cloud advocate anymore. I'm a different kind of cloud advocate for Microsoft, but here to manage this cohort and make sure we have all our special guests coming along to tell us our different topics each month. We've also got Nadia, who's joined us in the Reactor, now managing the events and stuff. So if you need to get in contact with us, you can email us and Nadia will get back to you. We remind you again of the code of conduct. Of course, we want to be respectful and welcoming and kind to everybody, be inquisitive and ask questions and be friendly with everybody here. So yeah, thank you all for abiding by our code of conduct. Just a reminder, we are recording, as I said, because I started the recording. Yeah, we will be putting out these videos as well, so you can catch up on them again later if you really want to watch Sonia again, which I think is highly likely. So yeah, that will be available, and we have the links, and I'll drop these links in the chat as well, so you can grab those in a bit. But finally, we need to introduce Sonia, our special guest speaker for this month. Sonia has so many wonderful things to say, so give me a hot minute to tell you all about them. Sonia is our wonderful New Zealand friend at heart, who's made it to Brisbane in Australia, which she now calls home, but she still supports the All Blacks. Sonia's IT career spans over 20 years, started in enterprise system administration and architecture for banking, government and defense, focused on Microsoft and IBM software platforms. Her last enterprise role was as a service delivery manager for a large systems integrator responsible for IBM developers and system administrators in multiple locations. Deciding to start a family, she quit her day job and started a business dedicated to small and medium business customers, which provided technical projects and support and helped customers to successfully adopt new technologies the right way, achieving a great business result. Here she dived into collaboration, productivity, and the future of work, including AI and bots, which is so relevant just of the last couple of months, really. So Sonia's lined up for success, even more than she's already had. Sonia was recognized for her community involvement, so Microsoft awarded her as an MVP, which is our most valuable professional award in the Office Servers and Service and Windows Insider category. She regularly engaged with other IT partners to help them keep up with rapid pace of change in our industry and authored several courses at Pluralsight. Now she's landed her dream job as a cloud advocate for Microsoft, which is a pretty good job, I have to say. Sonia writes online and speaks at events, appears in guest blogs and podcasts, and runs presentation and training both in person and online. With even greater involvement in technical communities of IT pros, she talks to them about their challenges operating workloads in the cloud, on-premises or hybrid environments. And she's going to share her wisdom with us today, which I'm very excited for this session because I've got a secret that I have to admit to is I haven't done my Azure Fundamentals exam, even though I've been here a year and a half. So Sonia's going to have me all prepped and maybe I'll just go and do my certificate next week. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sonia and stop sharing my screen. And yeah, I'll let you share all your wisdom.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Renee. Yeah, it's been a bit of a journey to get here. Most people I talk to don't set out to have a career in technology, and I don't know whether or not that's specific to the IT pro side of the fence more so than someone who's quite into developer languages, but a lot of that sort of happened by accident. It's a career talk all in itself, but I'm coming up to my 5-year anniversary at Microsoft, and I'm now leading 3 teams of global cloud advocates, which is so rewarding. It literally is the best job in the world. I love it. But we are here to talk about Azure Fundamentals. And the Azure Fundamentals exam, I've had people who have been in the room that are maybe thinking about it and aren't sure whether or not they can go and do it. By the time we sort of get through some of the basics and they get some good resources, they go and give it a crack and find out they pass. So it's not as daunting as you might think it is, especially if you've never done a Microsoft exam before, or it's been a very long time since you have done your first Microsoft exam. So it really is a great place to start. Now, I am going to give you a caveat. This is not official worldwide learning certification prep training. So the official curriculum that we put out to teach people how to prepare for this exam is literally a half day run twice. Usually is the format that it takes. So I can't compress all of that into a short time frame, but I will give you a really good idea of the kinds of topics that will be in it. And there may be some stuff that you come across as you do your learning after this session that I didn't mention, literally just because time. But let's go through and I will show you some of the concepts and the technologies that will come up and how to get best prepared for this exam. Now, we are a small group, so we won't have a formal question and answer session at the end per se on these topics. I'm more than happy to keep an eye on the chat as I speak. So if you've got any questions, if there's something I don't explain that you want a bit more detail on, or it pops up a question in your head, please feel free to pop that in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that and I'll kind of answer that as I go in this session. So what we're going to talk to today is some of the topics that are in this AZ-900 exam, including what is the cloud, can I trust it, what can the cloud do, how can I manage it, and most importantly, leaving you with some really good resources to continue your learning journey to get you ready to go and have a crack at that exam. So let's start with what is the cloud? This is one of my favorite questions because there is a sticker that floats around and a saying on the internet that, isn't it just somebody else's computer? And it is kind of. So this is a photo of inside of a hot bay area of one of our Azure data centers, and very much looks like computers, right? That we're just using that somebody else has. There are a few differences when it comes to cloud computing and how we use it, though, especially if you've come from a background where you've dealt with computers in any sort of large organization and what that infrastructure might look like. To start with, it's a little bit bigger than your average corporate data center, even if you work for a very large enterprise. So this was the most updated slide that I could find, where we have more than 65 Azure regions, lots and lots of miles of fiber and undersea cable, network point of presence, over 100 compliance offerings, 35 countries that have got services providing data residency in that country, and over 200 express route partners delivering some great connectivity into our Microsoft Azure platform. So there is a significant investment that cloud providers put into their infrastructure to get those workloads out to where the most amount of people are, and to build that connectivity, that resiliency, that redundancy, and that failover into other regions, more than any one in particular company could do on their own, the amount of investment that we put into this cloud infrastructure. Here are some great photos, because I think it's always nice to have an image of what does the cloud look like, and sometimes it looks like this. So this is one of our data centers in our North Europe region, which is in Dublin in Ireland. And you can see, if you have a look at the details of this photo, that some of those buildings look different from each other. So the numbers are the little areas of this data center that was spun up first. So you've got 3, 4, 5 over in the top, and then of course you've got 6, 7, and 8 down the bottom. And if you were to have a look at even just the building configuration in Dub 08, it looks very different to the buildings that you would see in Dub 3, 4, and 5. And that is purely because as cloud providers, we grow with the evolution of these data centers. It's not just about making them bigger, it's about making them more efficient a lot of the time, especially from building and plant and water use and electricity use and all of those sustainability things as well. So they do change over time as we bring up new sections of these data centers. And you can see that even in Dublin, we've got a huge area put aside for future campus works to allow us to grow in that area. So it's got a fairly sort of significant geographic footprint. One of the other interesting parts about this photo is the physical security. So you can see things like roundabouts and fencing, and there's a whole bunch of thought that goes into protecting the physical security of these data centers as well. Sometimes though, our cloud data centers look like this. So this is a data center in Singapore in our Southeast Asia region. You might know that real estate in Singapore is extremely expensive, and so you could never do a footprint like the Dublin data centre in Singapore because the massive amount of cost of actually getting land, if land was available in the areas where we need it. So for Singapore, we build up rather than out, and we actually stack the data center infrastructure that all of our compute power is housed in. So it's really interesting to see that the cloud looks different in different places depending on what the local conditions need to be. You might come across the term Microsoft Cloud. Now, that's not particularly an exam term, but as you work with Microsoft, you might hear this term come about the Microsoft Cloud. And I think some people can get a little bit confused between that and Azure, with Azure being our cloud. But the Microsoft Cloud is an umbrella term for all of our cloud-based services, which includes things like modern work, like M365, like Power Platform, like Dynamics 365, our security products. Everything comes under this banner of what we call the Microsoft Cloud. In addition to that, we've got these other cloud offerings as well, specifically for certain industries. So cloud for financial services, cloud for healthcare, cloud for manufacturing, all of these particular flavors of our cloud environment that are particularly tweaked to industry needs and their regulations and what needs to be sort of standard for them. And then the Microsoft Cloud for Sustainability is also something that is on the radar for people who are even more particular about their things like their carbon footprint and their sustainability goals. So how is cloud computing different from what you might be used to working with in a traditional organization? One of the terms that we use when we're talking about the cloud is something called utility computing. So with utility computing, when you walk into your house and you turn the light switch on, you're kind of hoping that the contract that you have with the electricity provider means that the electricity will instantly start flowing through your light bulbs and the light will turn on. Cloud computing very much is a utility computing service where I, as a customer, should be able to ask the cloud provider to provide a service for me, and they should be able to turn it on just as quickly. Now, the caveat on that is obviously some services take a minute to provision, or 2 minutes or a couple of minutes, depending on how busy data centers are. And then because we do break up our offerings into different regions, as a cloud provider, we also have to manage capacity in terms of what's available and how many virtual machines, for example, we can physically spin up in one region. So we do have some restrictions, just like your electricity provider might get overloaded if it's peak time in summer and everybody's running air conditioning, or if it's super cold in winter and we're all running the heating. So they do have some maybe brownouts or lags in their delay, but where possible, we try to make those services available as quickly as we can to our customers. So there's no, 4 to 6 to 8 to 12 weeks lead time for actually ordering a service and then being able to use it. And then we have this term of as a service, where it basically means that the cloud provider is responsible for doing a bunch of stuff for us as part of that contract. So we're not particularly stressed about how the electricity provider is providing the electricity, how they're looking after their power plants and their distribution networks and their high power cables, to get the electricity across the electricity network. They do all that stuff for us, and we can just consume those services and pay for them as we need them. Now, that is a little bit of a misnomer. It does kind of speak into this pay for what you use, or this consumption model, this as a service business, where the cloud provider is doing a bunch of work for the one price that we're paying for these resources. But we also need to talk about the shared responsibility model. So with the shared responsibility model, it's about being very clear as a customer in terms of what you are responsible for and what the cloud provider is responsible for. And I'll go into an example of that because I think we tend to overemphasize that the cloud provider does all the work, the customers don't need to do anything, and we look after everything. And that's not always the case depending on the particular cloud service that they're using. So let's take a look at an example here. When we're talking about technology, we look at a stack from the ground up, starting with things like networking and the server hardware itself, the disk storage, any virtualization that we might be running on that hardware, the operating system that the services are running on, the application itself, and then the data. And I don't think that Teams is going to play the animation for me, but in essence, you can apply this model to pretty much any technology. The challenges from a shared responsibility example, if we look at something like putting a virtual machine on Azure, Microsoft is responsible for the underlying network connectivity, though you may control some of the configuration of that. We look after the hardware of the server, we look after the disk storage, we look after the virtualization platform, but as a customer, you're responsible for the operating system, any applications, and your data. So if you're running a virtual machine inside Azure and the server is not able to be connected to it, it's not responsive, then we kind of go through this, where is the problem here? And if you can't connect to it, it's pretty hard for you to troubleshoot. It might just be a case of you creating a support ticket through to Microsoft to have a look at. But Microsoft may turn around and go, all of the underlying infrastructure is fine. It's an issue with the operating system. So Windows servers hit a glitch, it's outdated for whatever reason. You've run out of space on the disk that you have allocated into that operating system. And you're responsible for doing things like updates and patching to the operating system of that virtual machine. So it is very important that customers understand where their responsibility starts for what they need to manage and maintain, and they don't go in with expectations that Microsoft is doing everything for them. It's a different story with something like M365. So even if you take a service like Exchange Online, for example, which we do as a software as a service platform. So with a software as a service platform, there are a whole bunch of stuff that the customer doesn't need to worry about. They're not managing the operating system of Microsoft Exchange. They're not patching or upgrading the Exchange software itself. All they're really worried about in this case is the data. So the data that they're storing, if they're backing it up, what they're doing with information protection, all of that kind of stuff is their responsibility. So it's a very different model between what we call infrastructure as a service, which is our Azure Virtual Machine example, or software as a service, which is our Microsoft 365 example. For that, now another term that you'll come across is something called cloud models. And there is a little bit of confusion sometimes about what these mean. So I'll try my best to explain these as well. One of the terms that you'll hear is public cloud. Microsoft Azure is a public cloud. Anybody from the public can create an account in Microsoft Azure and use it. What that means is that you are sharing one data center, one cloud region, for example, and you are sharing the hardware that is in that region as well. So that is provisioned by Microsoft for a whole bunch of different customers to use, and you're sharing the same cloud data center infrastructure and hardware. But the cloud provider has full control over that part of the environment for you, and that's the part you don't need to worry about. So you might also hear about private cloud, and private cloud is sometimes referred to as on-premises, but there can be a slight difference. So in a very large enterprise, you can run computers in your own office. You can have a data center environment in your offices. We used to have one at the bank that I worked for. It was on the same floor as a help desk. It had the false flooring, the air condition, the emergency fire suppression system, like the works. It was a full-on data center that the bank owned. They managed everything. It was their responsibility to maintain all of that infrastructure, the network cabling, everything to do with that space, including all the hardware and everything that was in it of the servers and the racking. However, private cloud could also refer to a company that's using somebody else's data center. So there are a number of companies that offer data centers for hire, and they will look after things like the physical environment, the climate control, the electricity supply, the high-speed networking into that data center from the internet, those kind of things. And then it's a case of sometimes you can bring in your own hardware and put it in their rack, put a server in their rack in a space where you hire the space in the rack, or sometimes they control the hardware and they lease it to you. So you can use the hardware, but it's their hardware and they maintain it, just depending on the contract that you have with your data center. Now, even though that sounds like a cloud, it's actually still known as a private cloud because that space in the rack and that use of the hardware is 100% yours. You're not sharing it with anybody else. There's no other virtual servers on that hardware that belong to someone else, and you're responsible for that part of the stack up. Then the other term we talk about is hybrid cloud. And hybrid cloud is a little bit different from multi-cloud, but hybrid cloud is where we're using the best of both worlds. Like, why not use both? And I'm a big believer in this, as much as we say the cloud is everything, because it kind of is, but sometimes it isn't. There's still a lot of use cases where workloads need to remain on premises, really close to where a company is serving them from. And for a lot of companies, they may end up in this destination where they're running a mix of their own servers plus a little bit or a lot of cloud. But you can do that. You can totally do that. One of the cool things that we see in my area is people using cloud services to help manage their on-prem infrastructure, using things like Azure Backup and Azure Monitor, and I'll talk about some of that later. But challenge is it does kind of give you two environments to manage. So if you're used to managing servers in your own environment and now you've got resources in the cloud that probably aren't just servers, it's other types of services in Azure as well. How do you make sure that you've got processes in place or systems and tools where you're not duplicating your effort, or you can use the capability of the cloud to help manage your on-prem environment better? So that's what we mean when we talk about hybrid cloud and a little bit of the difference between public cloud and private cloud. Now, I did briefly mention when I talked about the shared responsibility model of this thing called infrastructure as a service. And so cloud service types are also something that comes up in conversation. So with infrastructure as a service, like I mentioned, the hardware and the networking capabilities are being looked after by the cloud provider, including things like the virtual machines, the disk storage, and the networking. Platform as a service is another one that I haven't talked about yet, and that's where you're providing a managed framework of services for applications to run on. So in Microsoft terms, it's things like we have a SQL database service, we have web apps, logic apps and functions, and even an Azure Kubernetes service for containers. So we manage part of that platform of the application itself, and then you go and build on top of that with your own databases, your own web applications that you're plugging into this platform, or containers that you're spinning up that sit on our managed Azure Kubernetes service platform. And then that next level, that software as a service, which is managed and updated applications that are written and provided by the cloud provider. So our M365, our Dynamics, and our Power BI are all really good examples where, as a customer, you're just going to log in, connect to that service that you want, and configure the applications or use the services like Exchange Online. One of the first things that you need to learn when you're dealing with Microsoft Azure is how it's structured. So we start off with a term called a tenant. And a tenant is basically the environment for that customer. It's usually boundaried by an Azure Active Directory environment, which is connected to the domain name of the company, and it's where the identities sit and all of the resources get created off that identity directory, much like you would have Active Directory in an on-prem environment that's storing all of the login names and the device and computer accounts. So Azure Active Directory will hold all of the login information, all of the user data for this one particular cloud environment, and then we will go and create our structure of our Azure resources. I'm actually going to start with subscriptions because subscriptions are the billing boundary. This is where the money flows. And so how you separate this really depends on how you want to organize your resources in alignment with your organization and your organization goals. And we've actually got a framework called the Cloud Adoption Framework that can help explain to companies how to best use that structure. But in essence, your subscription is where the bill gets paid. It's where the credit card is attached to or the invoice is generated. So if you need to break things out for your finance department at that level, that's where your sort of subscription boundaries are. But it then also breaks out these resources into sort of separate areas that you can manage. Now, I've put management groups at the top because with management groups, we can actually manage a bunch of different subscriptions and flow things down from the top all the way down for things that are related to each other. So I might be in an organization where it's really big and I don't just want one subscription for my production environment and one subscription for my test or my my test environment for my developers. I might need 3 different subscriptions for production environments because my organization has different subgroups or whatever reason. But those subscriptions that are all production subscriptions, there might be certain things like security requirements, naming regulations, resource tagging and metadata that I want to make sure that are all on these kinds of environments. And I can bundle those together in a management group to turn some stuff on at that top level and let it flow down. But more commonly, it's subscriptions and then resource groups that we find are being used as sort of those management boundaries. So once I have a subscription, it's an account that's got a method of payment attached to it, and that includes things like our enterprise agreements. Then I can start to create things like resource groups. So a resource group is like putting things in a folder. If you don't want to have a directory, if you don't want to have a filing system in OneDrive, for example, where every single document file that you've ever looked at is all in the root of your OneDrive, you're probably going to go and create folders. And resource groups are like folders for our resources. We tend to use them for grouping things together that have the same life cycle. So if I'm creating an Azure virtual machine, it isn't just one thing inside Azure. It's a VM, it's some disk storage, it's networking, it might be a public IP address. There are a few other little bits and pieces of Azure resources that get created. And if I've got 10 virtual machines, how am I going to know which public IP address is with which machine unless I go and look it up? Or if I want something to happen to all of the resources for one VM, it would be so much easier if they were in a folder or a resource group, so I can go, right, these are literally all of the things that are associated with this one virtual machine, and now I can manage them as a group of resources. So that's why resource groups are very important. That also gives you a little bit of an up with billing as well, because I can now run reporting. Even though I'm not going to get an individual bill for a resource group, I can run some really great reporting to tell me the cost of one resource group versus another resource group and which of these resource groups is the most expensive, it is costing me the most. So few advantages to sort of splitting things out like this, but just learning and understanding what these different things mean and how they fit together, the difference between a resource and a resource group, the difference between a resource group and a subscription, because these are terms in Azure that you will use all the time if you're dealing with Azure as a product. Now, let's move on to, can I trust the cloud? The interesting part about this question is that we don't hear it as often as we used to. And I think in the early days of cloud, people were a little bit more skeptical. They were a little bit more worried about trusting their business applications in an environment that they had no control over, because they can't go and, touch and feel and kick and reboot the server if the physical hardware is down. So it did used to be a lot more of a concern. And then especially when you get breaches in the media and people wondering whether or not the cloud is something we can trust. We don't hear that too much these days because I think the industry has matured and the people that are using cloud computing are seeing the controls that are in place and also understanding a little bit about where their responsibility is for security as well. So from a Microsoft specific what we do is we talk about the key trust principles of our cloud. So we'll help you to keep your data secure. We obviously bake as much security as we can into the physical infrastructure and who can access data and stuff like this. But if you go and put some data in and you configure a service to allow anonymous access, there's a really good chance that somebody anonymous will find it on the internet and connect to it and exfiltrate and take a copy of that data. Now, that's not because the cloud wasn't secure. that was because you configured it insecurely. And that's why we have programs that talk about things like zero trust and best practices for securing your environment, because there are legitimate reasons why you might want anonymous access to some data, like websites. Websites need to be able to view by anybody without them authenticating. So that kind of data, needs to be anonymous. But this is where sort of that crossover with the customer comes in. But we are very open and transparent about we will help to keep your data secure and some of the security mechanisms that we put in place. We're also very open about your data being private and under your control. So we don't do anything with your data. We don't sell it to third-party companies. We don't give anybody else access to it. And there's even restrictions around the access that we have to your data as support engineers when there's a problem. So there's a whole process in place for that as well. Compliance, we manage your data in accordance with the law, and obviously there are different laws in different regions, so we had to do that on a location by location basis. In Europe, we've got GDPR regulations, in healthcare in the US, there's other regulations, and here in Australia, we have rules and regulations as well in terms of what we do and how we manage data. We're really big on transparency and keeping it as simple as possible about what we do with your data. And that's written into a lot of our messaging and our resources on security and trust. And then reliability, it's obviously our job to make sure that our systems are up and available as much as possible. Doesn't necessarily mean the cloud is going to be 100% available. This is technology. Even if it's the cloud, comes down to physical hardware that can still break. It comes down to code that can still have issues when we do an upgrade. But it's about Microsoft having the responsibility to not only keep things running as well as we can, but to recover from faults and failures, even if those faults and failures were something that we inadvertently caused by accident. So the amount of resources that we have to keep our systems up and running or recover them if we fail far outweighs anything that a customer would have to manage their own environment. So I mentioned briefly about these regulations. We have the broadest compliance coverage in the industry. And so from that shared responsibility model, we certify that all of our infrastructure meets a significant number of these kinds of policies and regulations that are available, whether or not they're country specific, industry specific, for example. We can certify that the infrastructure or the platform that you're building on does meet these particular requirements. But then the next step is that you as a customer, when you go and build a specific application, for example, or you're using that service, you then have responsibility to make sure that what you're building is compliant with any regulations that you need to be compliant with as well, because we don't have any control over the solutions that you're building or the ways that you're using your data on our platforms. But we can tell you, and we do provide reporting online for people to see which of our services are compliant with which of our regulations. And I keep on coming back to this, that it's about Microsoft protecting you, because I think that's really important. This is an excerpt of a security presentation where it shows a little bit in detail. You can see there's 3 dots, the little 3 dots that are on some of those graphics means and more. So there's certainly a whole lot more to it than just these particular boxes. But things like our Cyber Defense Operations Center, our Malware Protection Center, our cyber hunting teams, a digital crimes unit, our Security Response Center, all of these things that Microsoft runs internally to monitor and protect our cloud environments against threats that are coming in. I've actually had the thrill of seeing it in Redmond, where you can peer down into one of these operation centres, and it literally looks like a scene from War Games. If you know that movie, I'm showing my age now, with all of the things lining up everywhere in terms of potential attacks and attacks that are happening on our cloud environment. So we do a significant amount of work to protect our cloud environment for all of our customers, and then you can engage our security experts if you have a particular threat or attack against your environment and your systems as well. And in addition to that, we've got some really strong industry connections with industry partners, with the antivirus network of people that create the antivirus signatures when threats come out, and a whole bunch of other sort of industry specialists that we connect with to stay on top of those threats as they emerge, and the part that Microsoft plays in that too. So For this particular reason, I don't think that this gets shown enough to our customers in terms of the amount of money that they're paying for our cloud and what they're actually getting for it. They quite often think that, oh, so they're getting a virtual machine or they're getting, the use of a particular service. But what they don't see is they're getting all of this as well. So there's a significant investment that Microsoft has in security and protecting our cloud environments that they don't necessarily realize is part of their bill. Really not commensurate to how much money and effort that we put into this level of protection for our customers. And again, I don't know how many times I will mention this shared responsibility model, but security isn't just about the cloud. It's also about the devices people are using to connect to these services, whether or not they're encouraging their people to have good password policies and multi-factor authentication, how they're configuring access to these resources, how they're configuring their applications, the settings on their virtual machine on their Windows server, and how they're doing information classification and protection. So a couple of just really good things to broaden the security conversation behind is the cloud secure, because there are a whole bunch of things that go into access into the cloud services that are the responsibility of the customer. This is one of the best resources if you're having this conversation, if you want to talk about security, privacy, compliance, what we do with our services, and all public facing, which is great for conversations with customers, and that's the Microsoft Trust Center. So this is one of the resources that's worth going and taking a look at. There's it's a really nice URL to find, or if you Google it, you'll come up with the link as well. But the Microsoft Trust Center is just one of those great resources that might be mentioned in a certain exam. Okay, so moving on. Now that we know that the cloud provider looks after most of the stuff, we also have the customers that have to do some things. There's different kinds of cloud models, how things are organized, and whether we can trust it and is it secure. What do we do with the cloud? What capabilities does it have? And I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight. I will leave you with a resource at the end of the talk that talks about what is measured in the exam in terms of what kind of things are included in the exam. The thing with exams is that they are modified and upgraded on an irregular basis. Okay, so it's not like there is a 3-month update cycle or even a 6-month update cycle, and we know how fast the cloud changes. This exam, and you can see this in the exam details on the public page, has not been updated since the introduction of ChatGPT and Azure OpenAI. So you can pretty much guarantee that those kind of technologies aren't going to be in the exam yet because the exam hasn't been updated. And the exam page will tell you when an update is being released and what is in the update and what has changed from the previous exam. So that is one of the tips for taking a Microsoft exam, is about using that guide that I'll link to at the end of this presentation to narrow down what you need to learn about, because it's not necessarily about everything that's the buzzword right now, because the exam may be behind that capability and not have it included yet. But there are some things that haven't changed in the cloud, and it's certainly things like infrastructure, virtual machines that we can run either the Windows Server or the Linux operating system on. We provide different types of storage. So even though ultimately at the end of the day it's a physical disk in a location, there are different ways that you can configure that. So you can use it as a virtual hard disk. You can use Azure Files. You can spin up a data lake to put unstructured data in, or you can spin up databases and put data in a more structured format in databases. So part of this exam is about understanding the capabilities of Microsoft Azure and what the difference is between these different services. What's the difference between Azure Files and a data lake? And I'll give you some resources so that you can go and dig into that level of detail and learn a little bit more. But it's about understanding the cloud enough to go, if a customer was looking to hold this kind of data or they had this scenario, which of these 4 services would they be best to use? We've also got things like networking, so Azure Virtual Networks, we provide a DNS service, we provide VPNs for secure access, encrypted end-to-end between the customer or their device and our cloud, and ExpressRoute, which is a connectivity that is provided by certain networking providers that goes straight into our Azure backbone for very high-speed access. Then we've got things like identity, so user accounts, user groups, conditional access that only allows people to authenticate based on a bunch of conditions related to that person and that login. So are they logging in from a country that we allow? Are we blocking certain countries, for example? That's kind of a good generic example of conditional access. And then things like multi-factor authentication, how that's configured, how that's provided in terms of the different authentication methods. So those are the kinds of things that we provide under infrastructure. Then we've got security, things like Key Vault for storing certificates and secrets, Microsoft Defender for cloud, and Microsoft Sentinel. Again, go and learn a little bit more about these different capabilities and understand the difference between them. Then Azure Hybrid, well, I mentioned using cloud services to manage your on-prem resources. That is primarily done through a solution called Azure Arc. And Azure Arc is a connector. It's a little agent that means that we can deploy it onto our on-premises resources, and it will project a resource in the Microsoft Azure cloud that looks like the thing that's on-prem. And then our Azure services, because they can now see that resource in Azure, they can connect to it and start managing it, backing it up, monitoring it, whatever. So Azure Arc in itself isn't a product. It's actually an agent and a connector into Azure to allow you to use a bunch of different services. And then we've got things like serverless and containers. So Azure functions that trigger based on an event, logic apps that let you put some routing and some if-then stuff in, containers, and Kubernetes, which is our container orchestrator for helping to manage our containers at scale. So gone are the days of just using virtual machines, and we're being dragged into a new world of serverless and containers, which our cloud native customers that aren't used to having a big physical box in their environment are really excited about. And our legacy customers are navigating the waters of where these are better alternatives for some of their business applications compared to building a fat application that needs to sit on a server operating system. And like the cloud in general, there are pros and cons on when these solutions are a better fit and when these solutions can actually get pretty expensive and are not as good an option. Then we've got advanced workloads like machine learning has been around for a little while longer, cognitive services for things like speech to text, IoT hub for Internet of Things devices, and then VR and augmented reality stuff like spatial anchors and digital twins. But go through the exam information in terms of what's measured, go through the learning path that I will recommend for you, and you'll be able to see which exact resources and services are included or not included in terms of what you might be tested on. And finally, how can I manage the cloud? If I've got all these resources up in Azure, what do I do with them? I'm going to introduce a term to you called FinOps that you won't find in the exam, but it's currently one of my hot passions because it's all about cloud cost management. And it's not just about cost management, it's about cost management as far as the industry knows it. So there is a foundation called the FinOps Foundation. They're a spin-off of the Linux Foundation, and Microsoft is one of their partners. And the partnership was sort of announced really recently. But what the FinOps Foundation is doing is it's about creating a culture of something called financial operations. So if you've heard of things like DevOps, where we are smashing together developers and operations staff and processes, it's all about processes and culture. FinOps is very much like that. It's about the culture and the processes inside an organization of managing cloud costs, because it's not centralized anymore. You don't have one person sitting in the office signing off the purchase order to go and approve the hardware to be bought. You've got decentralized access to different developer teams, for example, or business units that can spin up resources in the cloud. So how do you control all of that from an organizational perspective and making sure that everybody's got the right visibility, they've got the right tools, and you've got this really good culture and processes in place across your entire organization that still lets people down at a macro level do the things that they need to be able to do to take advantage of that flexibility and that scalability that they've got with the cloud. So these are the FinOps principles. Again, they're not in the exam per se, but we're doing a significant amount of work at the moment to take those industry principles and create Microsoft-centric content around these conversations to help bring our Microsoft customers into good processes with a FinOps framework. What we do look at, though, is some of the tools in Microsoft that you can use to manage and control costs. And that includes things like the total cost of ownership calculator and the pricing calculator, as well as things like the Azure Migrate tool that can help estimate costs, the savings plans and reserved instances and hybrid use benefits, and then things like Azure Policy that we can actually use to restrict what people can do in the cloud. So I can create an Azure policy that says, block the creation of E-Series virtual machines. E-Series virtual machines can get really expensive. Like I think there's one there that's $16,000 a month. You don't want people creating that by accident or creating it because someone thought it was a good idea to have a really powerful machine in the cloud without you getting the surprise bill at the end. So there are things that you can do with Azure Policy to help control some of that cost stuff as well. And then we have our Azure Cost Management and Billing section that helps you analyze the current usage, set budgets and alerts, that kind of thing, and Azure Advisor that will give you advice on looking at the workloads and saying, hey, you might want to do some right sizing here. You're paying for a virtual machine that's actually way more powerful than the use that it's had over the last period of time. So you could actually downsize that and save you some money. I love having that conversation with customers about how they can spend less with us. It feels a little bit counterintuitive. But the total cost of ownership calculator and the pricing calculator are where most people start. And most people don't know about the TCO calculator. They only know about the pricing calculator. And the pricing calculator is where we can literally get access to a whole bunch of different Azure resources. It's a public-facing website, and you can put in different configurations and see what different settings do to change the estimated costs over time of those Azure services. The total cost of ownership calculator I love because it is more about comparing, if I had this on-prem and I went to put it in the cloud, would it save me money? Would it be cheaper in the cloud? And for me, it's not so much with the TCO calculator about the fact that generally it does show you that things are cheaper in the cloud, but it really opens people's eyes to how much cost there is from running something on-prem, because it makes a bunch of assumptions that they can change, but it literally talks about things like the servicing costs of maintaining a network switch, or the electricity unit prices, and a whole bunch of stuff that are really hard to see when you go, well, I just bought a server and I chucked it in the data center. So that sort of level of granularity in the total cost of ownership calculator is really eye-opening if you're sort of having that compete conversation with customers. So definitely worth knowing about those two capabilities. Then in terms of managing these cloud resources, what are we going to do with them to get them configured the way that we want to configure them? You have a bunch of different options. So you've got the Azure portal where you can log in through your web browser. You've got a nice GUI interface where you can click and drag and drop and move things around and change a whole bunch of settings inside the Azure portal, see the status of stuff that's running, for example. Then we have Azure Cloud Shell. So Cloud Shell is actually triggered from the Azure portal. There's a little icon at the top that you click on, and it brings up a PowerShell terminal session. So you can go and type in PowerShell commands into that window to either go and interrogate things, like if you want to find out a list of virtual machines inside your subscription, you can issue a command and it'll give you out a list. That's a little bit quicker and easier if you know the commands than going through the interface and looking at that. Or if you want to do something at scale, that again is a lot easier than clicking through different blades and panes in that Azure portal. You might want to create a new tag and apply it to a whole bunch of resources at once. So you can use PowerShell to do things like that. And then there are some resource configurations that you need to do via PowerShell commands that aren't available in the Azure portal as well. So this is a way of getting a command line interface to manage your Azure resources without you needing to do anything at all on your computer, because this is all browser-based through the Azure portal. In addition to that, you've also got Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI. So these are two different flavors of commands for managing Azure resources, and you install the Azure PowerShell model into your Windows PowerShell that you go and install on your machine. So you need to have the PowerShell environment installed on either your PC or your Mac, and then you'd import the Azure module to give you that Azure PowerShell commands and connect into your Azure environment that way. So a couple of different ways to do things depending on what you're doing, depending on what your preference is. And then we also use templates. Now, from memory, I don't think Azure Bicep has made it into the exam update yet, but it's also worth knowing that with Azure, what we talk about is something called the Azure Resource Manager, which is the management layer of the cloud that your cloud resources sit on top of. And we can use these Azure Resource Manager templates to define what a resource looks like. And it's actually a pretty long file by the time you put everything in there you need. So we've also created a new language called Azure Bicep, which makes it a lot easier to do this. You can see just by looking at this slide that the Azure Bicep file is a lot smaller. This is a storage account, and the definition in Bicep versus the definition in an ARM template is a lot smaller in Bicep. It's a lot easier to make little components of Bicep and link them all together and reuse them. And it actually does expand out into an Azure resource template in the back end anyway for Azure to go and work on. But worth knowing that templates are a thing, and as I said, I don't think Bicep is heavily in the AZ-900 exam as it stands, but you may come across the term, and it's the direction that we are sending our customers in. Lawrence, you got a question about Terraform. Where does it fit into the templates picture? Great question. Terraform is it's a cloud agnostic command or set of commands. So we do have support for Terraform if you want to create a definition for an Azure resource inside Terraform. You can certainly use Terraform definitions to deploy resources in Azure. And you might be doing that if you were using another cloud, for example, or you are using more than one cloud, because we do have companies that might be using Azure and AWS, for example. So they absolutely can have Azure resource definitions inside Terraform and use Terraform to deploy into Azure. It's just that ARM and Bicep are Azure specific. So you can't use those in other people's clouds, but you can use things like Terraform inside our cloud. So I hope that answers your question. And then we have monitoring the cloud. So we have things like Azure Backup for backing up data and resources. We have Azure Monitor for the performance of the services and, whether things are using up too much disk space, for example. We have Azure Service Health that will give you alerts if a particular service is down at a service level. So if, heaven forbid, Azure Active Directory was down, only in the Australia region, I could configure service health alerts, so I would get a notification, an email, or it would be on the public portal page that there was a service issue with the service. So I know that it's nothing particular in my tenant that I've done wrong. It's not a problem with my one thing. It's actually a bigger issue with the service. So service health alerts are worth taking a look at and subscribing to. I did mention about Azure Advisor and how Azure Advisor can give us recommendations for things like cost management and downsizing. It also gives you a whole bunch of other recommendations, including security recommendations as well. And then Azure Policy for setting the guardrails or the rules around how you want things to be configured in your environment. And you can either set that on audit mode, so you can be alerted if something is drifted outside of that configuration you want, or you can set it to enforce. So things will be blocked from being able to be changed or created if they don't meet the rules and regulations that you've set. So that's a very handy one to look at. This has been such a big topic, so I'm going to wrap up now and leave you with all the resources that you can dig into a little bit deeper. Some of the things I've mentioned will resonate when you're going through this content, but the way that we do exams at Microsoft is based around our Microsoft certifications. So our certification path includes fundamentals level exams, associate exams, and expert level exams across all of this bunch of different products that we provide. For the Azure 900 Microsoft Azure Fundamentals, this is the first one I want you to start with on your Azure journey. The first link to visit is the exam page, where it tells you a little bit more about the exam. In particular, that thing that I mentioned is the Skills Measured Guide. So download the Skills Measured Guide and it will tell you exactly what it is that you will be required to describe or understand for the exam. And there is a link in there to a free practice assessment. So as a Microsoft, you can click on the link inside that module and actually run through some of the practice exam questions. The exam itself is 60 minutes, it's multi-choice, and there are no lab exercises. So you won't be asked to do something and given a simulated lab environment. It's all multi-choice questions. Microsoft Learn is your best place for learning and preparing for this exam. At learn.microsoft.com, I've actually put direct links in there to the AZ-900 content about the different things that are in the exam. If you walk through this, you will have I'd almost say 100% of what you need for the exam is covered in here, because this content on Microsoft Learn was specifically written to the study guide to make sure that it includes everything that's in the exam and nothing that isn't in the exam. So those learning paths are your absolute best place, aside from learning a little bit more, digging around the portal, creating some stuff and playing with some of the concepts. In addition, we do have Microsoft Azure virtual training days. So the virtual training days, they're free, they're online, they're instructor-led. You can sign up for them at this. They do fill up pretty quickly, so you might need to pick one that's in the future a little bit more. But this is the official Microsoft training curriculum to prepare you for the exam. So combination of maybe do the self-learning, self-paced stuff over on Microsoft Learn, and then enroll yourself in a Microsoft Virtual Training Day, because then you'll have access to the chat and to bounce things off an instructor that you don't quite understand. And that's it. You've had AZ-900 in a nutshell. I know it's been a whirlwind tour. Thank you so much. It's a short period of time to cover that. And I'm going to stop sharing my presentation. Actually, no, I'm not going to stop sharing my presentation. I'm going to go back to that link, because I think that that's probably the most important one. The links in this presentation are clickable. I'll maybe sit down with Renee and do a bit of a copy and paste session into the chat for people who will be watching the recording, because I know that links aren't clickable on recordings, but we might just dump those in the chat as well for people that have got them. So I'm more than happy to hang around. I know that it's top of the hour and you may have other work to put off, but to go off to. But yeah, if anybody else has any questions, feel free.
I'll also have another slide to tell us what we're doing about next month. But I've popped in the chat the links from the slide earlier. Amazing. So if you're joining new to the cohort, which I know we had some people who are joining new today, we had some pre-work. That's a Cloud Skills Challenge. You can go through and learn some of the stuff that was leading into this. And then we have a coursework Cloud Skills Challenge where you can go through and we've linked to the Microsoft Learn workshops content that you can go and do to prepare to do your Azure Fundamentals exam. There's a link to sign up for the next month session, as well as the ones we have in between the months where you can just come and ask any questions. I'll be there. It's just a very open session where you can just have a chat, and often people just come and have a chat about life or what it's like to try and get back into the workforce. So whatever you want, or come and ask a technical question. And then I've also added the LinkedIn group, which we haven't been as good at updating once Sarah left, but if you need something, you can hit me up in there, as well as hit up Nadia at the Reactor Sydney Microsoft address. And then I also have a couple of links. So I've put in the link to do the Azure Fundamentals exam if you're like, oh yeah, I really want to do that. But I've also, and that costs $99 US to do, but I've also put in a link to the Azure Bootcamp, which is coming up, where they cover like 4 different Azure topics, and then so that costs $49, but you get a certificate, a free voucher to do one of the certificates included in that. So you get all the training, and then you get like the cost of doing the workshop for like a third of the price. So I'm not here to sell things, but just like if you're going to do something, you should know about that one, so you get more training. If you enjoyed what Sonia was talking about today, which I did, then you might want to hit that up as well. So that's coming up. I'll just share my final slide, which has the topic for next time around. There we go. And here we go. So yes, coming up next month, we have a session on bringing your career and a project to life, how modern teams use Agile methodology as well. So it's covering both Agile methodology with Ariane, and then also we're covering how to sell yourself basically on LinkedIn. So making your LinkedIn awesome, especially if you're going to go and do these certificates or you want to show off the things you've been learning. Michelle's going to show us how to make sure our LinkedIn stands out from the rest. She's very good at LinkedIn. She's very visible on LinkedIn. So if someone's going to tell you about LinkedIn, come and hear it from Michelle, and come and hear about, Agile workflows and working as a team, that kind of Scrum Mastery kind of ideology from Ariane. So we've got half an hour and half an hour from both of those next time. So it's a combo session. It's going to be great. But yeah, that's going to be our final skilling session. But we do have one more before then. We've got another catch-up session. And after then, we have the final catch-up / closing ceremony chill hangout. Yeah. Yeah, make sure you sign up for those on the link, the Register Reactor Moms in Tech link above. Awesome. Any questions from anyone else? I'll stop the recording now. Maybe people want to ask off the recording.